evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a very special occasion, an evening with one of Australian literature's undisputed greats, the poet, novelist, essayist, librettist, memoirist, and formidable cultural voice, David Malouf. And leading David in conversation tonight, we have the privilege also of having with us a rising star of Australian letters, the multi-award winning poet, scholar, essayist, Lisa Gorton. Please welcome them both. My name is Maura Fraser and I'm chair of the board of Australian Book Review. It's a multi-pronged celebration we're here for tonight. We're celebrating, if you'll forgive me, David Malouf's longevity. This, blessedly, is his 80th year, but we're also celebrating his ongoing achievement. He is, it seems, unstoppable. David's birthday month coincided this year with the publication of two new books, The Poetry of Earth Hour and The Essays of the First Place. And later tonight, more celebration, Australian Book Review, in the person of its editor, Peter Rose, will honour David Malouf as its inaugural laureate in recognition of just the sheer range and the profundity of David's literary work, and also as an acknowledgement of his public spiritedness. You don't always say this about writers. David's been a great friend to literature in Australia, a great friend to Australian Book Review indeed, but to Australian letters generally. And we pay tribute tonight to his exemplary generosity, his cultural advocacy, and for being what he is to his fellow writers, to important Australian important Australian cultural institutions, and to you, the Australian reading public. No more ado, Lisa and David.
Thank you, Maura, and welcome at the end of this very beautiful day. It is wonderful to be with David Malouf, one of the people who could legitimately distract you from the very beautiful view at our backs. David is one of the great writers, but he's also, I think, a loved writer, and I think most of us are here because he is loved. He's one of the most intimate of writers, and we feel that we know him because in his writing he gives us a more inward sense of ourselves and of our own place. And those are the threads that I want to follow through this evening's conversation. David and I are going to concentrate on his poetry, not only poems from Earth Hour, but across his writing life. But I wonder whether to start, David. I could ask you to read a poem.
This is a poem written in the last few years. It's called The Seven Last Words of the Emperor Hadrian, and it's a version of a very small Latin poem. I think there are something like 19 words, 45 syllables in this poem, but I've done something with it which I feel you need to do with the translation. Poems in any language are always layered with meaning, and if you follow one layer of the meaning in a translation, you miss all the others. So what I've done is translated this little poem 7 times over, and I'll just begin with a reading of the poem in Latin. The poem itself is quite strange because it's a dialogue between the body and the soul, but it's full of diminutives, and you can hear that in the animula, blandula, pallidula, rigida, nudula. You can't do that in English without it sounding silly. So I had to find some other way of dealing with that. But I'll just read the, the poem. First of all, the Latin. Animula, vagula, blandula, hospes comosques corporis, quae nunc abibis in loca, pallidula, rigida, nudula, Necut soles dabis iokos. Dear soulmate, little guest and companion, what shift will you make now, out there in the cold? If this is a joke, it is old, old. Soul, small wandering one, my lifelong companion, where will you go, numb, pale, undefended, now the joke we shared is ended? Little Lightfoot spirit, housemate, bedfellow, where are you off to now? Cat got your tongue, lost your shirt, caught your death? Well, the last laugh is on you, is on us. Sweet urchin, fly by night, heart's guest, my better half and solace, you've really done it this time. You've played one trick too many. Fool, you've laughed us both out of breath. If this is one of your jokes, my jack in the box, lay off. Where have you got to? It's cold out there. And what will you do without me, you sweet idiot? Go naked, homeless, come back to bed. What's this, old mouse, my secret sharer? Gone where? Did you think I'd let you slip away without me after a lifetime of happy scrapes? Who warmed you, clothed you, fed you, paid with laughter for your tricks, your japes? Is this the one joke, poor jackanapes, dear bugaboo, your emperor does not get? So you're playing fast and loose, are you? You've cut the love knot. Well, let's see how you get on out there without me. Who's kidding who? Without my body, its royal breath and blood to warm you, my hands, my tongue to prove to you what's real, what's not, poor fool, you're nothing. But oh, without you, my sweet nothing, I'm dust.
I love that poem. It seems to me on Shakespeare's Birthday, as it is today, that's a poem which plays and has a great deal of fun with Shakespearean language. Some of those endearments are ones that you could have King Lear saying to his fool, or Prospero saying to Ariel. Was that something you were playing with as you wrote?
I was certainly playing with, you know, when you write a poem, you are placing the poem in the whole of the writing in that language. And I think one of the things that makes translation so difficult is a word in a poem, however simple it is, comes with a history of how that word's been used in other poems, and that's often something you can't translate at all. So certainly I was very aware that this little poem, which is a pagan poem, is very closely related to poems that I've always loved, metaphysical poems in English of the early 17th century, contemporary with Shakespeare, where quite often one of the things the poet was doing was writing a dialogue between the body and the soul. And, you know, we, in a kind of Christian culture, have a sense that the relationship between the body and the soul is an unequal one, in which the soul is in every way superior. This little poem really doesn't really have that notion at all. But then neither, for the most part, did the metaphysical poets who were dealing with it, because whatever religion told them, the body in poetry is so absolutely present that the body kind of always ends up winning.
Well, we're talking in a way about the tradition of language, and Eliot, who had that fabulous notion of tradition, also suggested that Donne, one of those metaphysical poets, had a sensuous apprehension of a thought. But it seems to me that's something I would say of you, even more than done, probably. It seems to me so many of your images are ones held within the span of the body, the hand and the breath.
Yeah, look, I've surprised myself, and you don't always recognise things that recur in your own work, but they're very revealing and they give an awful lot away. And I was surprised, for example, when I was looking at the whole range of the poems in this volume, when you put it together, how the sense that I keep going back to is touch.
Yeah.
And that, touch seems to me to be the first of the senses we have, and obviously the last. And that's not always the sense that people want to talk about as being essential in the same way that vision is, for example, to the whole visual world, and hearing, smell. But, I was surprised by how much of the sensory reference of the poems in that last book are to do with touch.
I love that about them. And it seems to me far more than a divide between the mind and the body in your work. There is this sort of grappling all the time with language and the desire for it to be touchable.
Yeah, it's sort of... I think I realised quite early when I was becoming a proper reader of poetry. I was brought up in that educational world where the first thing you did with any poem was learn it by heart. Yeah. So it became immediately a musical thing and belonged absolutely to the world of sound. And I think that's a wonderful way of coming to poetry, because if you learn something like Wordsworth's Daffodils off by heart when you're 10, of course you don't understand what the poem is about. But when you're 18, 19, 20, and you come to look at the poem again and you need to grapple with what it's about, you are very, very surprised how much of the poem's real meaning is already there with you, because you know the sound of it, because you know the music of it. But it was about that time too that I began to realize that my own feeling, I think, for words is about their density, or their shape, or the tactile quality of the language of other poets was what I was really attracted to. So I think our attitude to our reading and our discoveries through our reading changes and grows, but recognizing the tactile quality of language is, for me, a real breakthrough, and was what I think really made me want to write poetry.
Well, I want to go back to that sense of the childhood when you were reading aloud, because I think childhood is such a presence in your work, in Earth Hour and in other poems as well. And I was remembering you wrote a beautiful piece on D.H. Lawrence where you were discussing as a child learning poems off by heart. And I wondered if you would paint a picture of yourself as that 9 and 10-year-old who was learning poetry, and talk about what that meant to you then.
I think, language, it seems to me, has always been absolutely essential to me. I was fortunate because I grew up in a household where people read aloud. My mother was a great reader, and we had a girl called Cassie who, she cleaned the house, she cooked, she largely brought my sister and me up. And my mother and Cassie would always spend the late afternoon doing whatever they had to do, like Wednesday was mending, so they did all the mending. But other days they'd be peeling potatoes or shelling peas or whatever. And one of them always read aloud to the other. And so I, very early on, quite apart from the things that my mother read to me, and they were fairy stories, Grimm mostly, and Hans Andersen, and David Copperfield, and Bible stories. They would be things that my mother read aloud to me, but I also listened in to those readings. And I must be the only 8 or 9-year-old in the country who grew up hearing read aloud all the novels of Mrs. Henry Wood. It's a pretty rare thing. But, you know, there was East Lynne and the Channings and Verner's Pride and Mrs. Dainsbury's Troubles and all of those books I heard read aloud, but also Dickens. And they were times too when even commercial radio stations in Australia, quite apart from the ABC, read a book aloud every afternoon. And quite often I first came to books by hearing them serialized in that way in readings on the radio, and then went off and read them myself. So hearing things read aloud, and the thing that I always think of is, and this is something that I think is still there and that we can be happy with and will kind of never go. If you're a very small child, adults have a particular magic trick they can play, which you can't play. And they can take this thing that's like that, this little closed box, and they can open it up. And when they open it up, they do some trick by way it becomes a sound and speech and stories. And I think any small child really is absolutely fascinated by that and wants as quickly as possible to learn the trick of doing that for himself. And so I think that remains, you know, even in these days when kids realize you can do that, or do that, they still want to know how you do this other thing of opening this absolutely strange object, and in there are all these stories and things.
In Earth Hour, you have the poem, dot poem, The Connections. Do you remember learning to read? That seems as though you're having a sense of that poem is set at the coming into language.
Yes, I don't remember when I learned to read, but it happened very early, and it happened before I went formally to school. And I think it came about because my mother read things over and over again to me, and when I went back to the book and found that story, I found in some kind of way that because I knew the stories off by heart, I could work out how the words on the page were related to things. And so I remember, what I do remember is sitting on a step and one of the girls who lived in the flats next door said, "What are you doing?" I would have been maybe about 4. And I said, "Oh, I'm reading this book." And she said, "Oh, yes, well, read something to me." And I read it. And she couldn't believe it. And I wasn't surprised because I knew I could do it, but I can't remember how I learned to do it. And I think there are people who've learned to read that way.
Well, I think it's still part of the rapture of your work, isn't it? That sense of the mystery of language. It's still very present, and this play with it and this sense of it as an element.
Yeah, it's one of the places where you feel you have some kind of real power of control. And there is a kind of almost drunken pleasure, you know, of going and playing around with words on the page. You know, when people say to me, "Are you still writing?" You know, what I usually say is, "Oh, well, look, I'm still fiddling about a bit," and that seems to me to be what it is, and it's what comes out of that is not expected, that is the real pleasure of writing, and if all you were doing was setting down something you already had planned or knew, there would be no excitement in it at all. So it is that business of going with a couple of words or some phrases in your head and then putting them on the page. And it's only when you actually put them on the page that they have the kind of other reality, which means you can now start making them do things.
Well, I want to spend a bit of time discovering that drunken pleasure with you, because I do think one of the joys of your writing is the way it opens that experience to readers of being within worlds. And I wonder, I think you once called it the delicate sidestep syntax. And your poems, because they live on the breath and they're wonderful to read aloud, come easily into the mind and easily into the body. But when you spend time with them, you realise they are crafted minutely and delicately and with a sense of a philosophy of form. So that's what I want to play around with in the conversation a bit. Do you say them aloud as you sit and write?
No, I don't say them aloud except in my head. Mm-hmm. But yes, I'm saying them aloud in my head. And the music of them is very important, not because it's kind of an added thing, but because for me that's where the sense is. That's where the ideas are being worked out, partly in the way echoes occur. I mean, I really love about words, and especially English is very good with this. You know, people sometimes say that English is very weak in rhymes, and that for that reason it's not musical, for example, in the same way that Italian is. But because English has a huge number of monosyllables, and even words that are more than one syllable, there's a syllable in the word which is the key syllable. English has an amazing pattern of half and quarter rhymes. And that's what I really love allowing to lead me in putting lines down in a poem, is the echoes of those rhymes and half rhymes.
I read in an article that Susan Wyndham wrote about you that you also worked on the poem sometimes while you were ironing or when you were walking.
Look, I think that, and I'm not the only person who says this. Lawrence says it, for example, when he says that when he was looking at his early poems and didn't like them and was taking them out of the collected thing, the collection he was making, he said that what writes poems is a demon in you. And he means simply by that some other kind of agency than your ordinary thinking mind. And that what young men tend to do is to distrust the demon or be scared of what the demon might say and put their hand very firmly over the demon's mouth and write a poem which is no good. And that what you've got to do is to sort of let the demon speak. And Kipling says something like the same thing. He says what you do is you drift, yield and obey, or something like that to the demon. I think what that is a kind of dreaming, almost, other self that goes about its own thinking patterns under our conscious thinking. And I think there are things we do with our body again which allow that to work very, very well. And walking is one of them. Mm. There's something about the pace of walking. I mean, that wonderful word andante, which is one of my favorite of all words, which is at walking pace, at which all the most extraordinary music that I know unfolds. I think walking, where you're not quite thinking, but your body is moving and something is thinking for you, that's a very, very good place where writing can take place. And I often, if I'm walking, find myself writing, if I'm working on a novel or a story, writing a whole paragraph. And the other one too, a kind of mindless task like ironing is really very good. You've got to be there and you've got to watch what you're doing, but your mind is going absolutely somewhere else. And where your mind is going is a very useful place.
I must do more ironing. But you were talking about D.H. Lawrence and the demon, but I think what's so interesting, or one of the things that I I find so wonderful in your work is actually how early in your work you discovered, I don't know what to call it, the themes or your nature as a writer. I mean, if you look at Interiors, which were the set of poems that you published with 3 other poets as your first publication, the interest in rooms and in the body is there.
Yeah, look, I think that if the poetry is properly grounded, it is in something in you which is very, very personal and goes back a very long way. And yes, it should be there early. I mean, you may not be aware of it in the way you will be aware later. And in some ways, you can only begin to see what your writing does, whether it's in a novel or in stories or in poems, when you've done enough of it to be able to look at it and say, oh, that's what I do. Because you're not, I think, conscious at first of the poems that come out in that way. And it's only after a time that you can see that there's a kind of pattern here, a kind of particular a set of preoccupations or concerns or puzzlements or questions that you'll go back and back to. I think that one of the things that I see now, that both in novels but also in poems, which I am always trying to resolve, is a whole lot of things that our culture has set up as being oppositions, which I don't accept as oppositions and keep wanting to break down. And body and soul, mind and emotion, light, dark, male, female, you can go through all of them. A lot of the work, it seems to me, is intent on taking those things and letting them begin as oppositions and then kind of deconstructing or destroying that possibility of seeing it as in that way.
Well, I wondered about that because, I mean, often your poems are lyric poems, but there often does seem to be a sort of dramatic encounter in them or a tension that you're working out. One of the things I wanted to ask you about with Earth Hour was about the interesting gardens that you show in that book. And I've written about this, so you probably know that I'm going to ask about it. But in one of your early poems, early discoveries, you wrote about being a child in a garden with your grandfather who was 80 and who was minding the garden. And you're 80 and you've brought out a collection which is full of poems about gardens and also has these references to children in it and to some of the rapturous things like discovering words and reading or coming into language that are so interesting. Was that in your mind, that recollection of being a child in the garden?
You mean when I wrote that poem about my grandfather?
I mean, when you were writing Earth Hour and all the poems in it that are set in gardens, do you think there was a recollection of earlier work?
I'm quite fascinated by the way when people get older, and if you say to them, what do you spend your time doing these days, how often people say, oh, I like pottering around in the garden. And it does have something to do with watching things grow and go through their cycles, watching things give up. I mean, I'm very aware, for example, of my impatience with plants that sort of are refusing to get along and survive. And there's a certain, point at which you lose patience with them and say, okay, if you want to die, well, just die. And I think there's a lot of feeling about really, really essential questions in the garden. I mean, one of the things, I just have a little courtyard garden in Sydney, but one of the things I noticed there, which I find actually quite comforting, And that is, if you work in the garden long enough, you realise that we are not, in fact, the most voracious and cannibalistic of creatures on the planet. Plants are. And you see that there's a kind of... it's actually mentioned in there. You know, this kind of notion that we have of live and let live, plants don't feel that. You know, there's a certain amount of space and they want as much of it as possible for themselves. They're interesting things to look at, and I think there's something of the same kind of curiosity and wonder there that little children have, because again, you know, little children love nothing so much as to be given a little patch of plants to deal with and to watch grow, watch die, or whatever it is. So I think there's a kind of coming full circle about that interest. And you know, that is kind of, in the end, a really essential interest in the planet and how we're related to it. I've also always been impressed by the fact that one of the things that was that I used to hear said most often when I was a small child, and you'd be fiddling around in the garden and getting, you know, eating things that you shouldn't be eating, and people would say, some old lady would say, "Oh, don't worry about it. He'll eat a peck of that before he's dead." You know, which meant that you, in your lifetime, you ate a peck of dirt. And that was always a phrase. I've gone back to that phrase in several poems, because it obviously sort of fascinated and worried me when I was a child, and I'm still fascinated by it, and I still haven't got to the end yet of my peck of dirt.
Yes, that's a beautiful image, isn't there, of you under the steps eating dirt in one of the poems.
Yeah, that's a poem called Nostalgia, yes.
Yeah. Would you read us another of the garden poems from Earth Hour before we talk some more, so that people can hear the garden poems?
This first one is called Touching the Earth. The season when all is scrabble and surge and disintegration. Worms in their black cafe, a pinch-gut Versailles rabble remaking the earth, processing tea bags, vegetable scraps, and hot from the press news of the underworld, the fast lane, to slow food for the planet. Plum blossom, briar rose commingling. Overhead, pure flow, a commodious blue, fine brushed with cirrus. In our part of the world, we call this spring. Elsewhere, it happens otherwise and in other words, or with no words at all under fin-shaped palm frond and fern in greenhouse weather. But here, we call it spring, when a young man's fancy turns fitfully, lightly, to idling in the sun, to touching in the dark. And the old man's to worms in their garden box, stepping aside a moment in a poem that will remember fitfully who made it, and the discord and stammer and change of heart and catch of breath it sprang from, a bending down lightly to touch the earth.
One of your earlier poems, An Ordinary Evening at Hamilton, seemed to me to be a transformative poem in your work. And in that poem, you brought the outdoors indoors. And there was that dramatic encounter that we were talking about before, or that I was thinking about before, between indoors and outdoors, folded into itself in that poem. And I feel with these garden poems, as it were, you've gone out from the room into the garden with this collection.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned that very early group of poems called Interiors, and there's a poem in there which is called Indoor Garden.
Yes.
And it plays some sort of strange game between that. It's just a matter of the way in which you catch yourself going back to things, repeating yourself, going back and looking at the same set of circumstances and seeing something different in it, drawing a different apprehension from it. So yeah, there are echoes, I think, and that's how it should be.
Oh, I think it's wonderful, and I think it gives a kind of generative power because you remake things, and I think my impression is when you're writing, it must be astonishing because you enter it. It seems to me you enter into the place of all the things that you've written, as it were, and you're playing with certain images that you've touched on before that have new life.
Well, look, I think that what writing mostly grows out of is puzzlement. And in some ways, that's the puzzlement of a small child who kind of remains in there. And I don't know, maybe most people grow up and the things that have puzzled them as children, they eventually get satisfactory or half-satisfactory answers to. I think writers are people who never get any satisfactory answer to the questions they've asked, whether they ask them as children or later. And so they're always working through some kind of puzzlement. And going back to those same old things and saying, I've been through all of this before, and what I worked out last time I thought was a good place to arrive at, but I'm still as puzzled as I was. Let's try again. And so I think there is a way in which, yes, you never get to the end of the questions. And they're all questions that must begin very, very early.
Well, I thought of you because my 3-year-old, then 2, said to me, "Where is my body?" And I thought, that's a David Malouf question. What a prodigy, darling. But it seems to me the other side of it, if we're talking about the sort of the rapture and the wonder that one, reading your work, one comes in contact with, that gives a great intimacy to your writing, but there's also the other tension in it, in your writing too, of an enormous erudition. So I'm often sort of entranced by something, and then I realize what you're touching here in your own life is a mythic element. So I think there are several references, for instance, to a green original, or to Eden, to a green original anti-Eden. So when you go into the garden, you're coming in contact, I think, with that childhood wonder and that touch of the earth. But there's also the pull in your mind, isn't there, of the literary history of those images and the human history of gardening, which stretches back and places you in a long tradition.
Well, it is a literary history, but I think it's a pre-literary history as well. And I think that one of the things that interests me in, say, the novel, is that the novels that seem to me to touch people most, and the novels that we remember most and go back to, when you actually look at them, somewhere right at the center of them is a very, very simple and very old story. And that story, the story making that comes out of, it goes back almost through fairy stories, folk stories, epic stories, really to dreams. And that the kind of world of dreams, which we live in for a very large part of our life, each day, that somehow being able to tap what it is that works there, and the way action and development happens in that dream world is a very, very good way, if you can step into it, of writing both fiction and poetry. And so, that's, yes, there's a lot of that gets into literature. But for a lot of people who are not necessarily literate even, it exists as well, but it exists in ordinary life.
Ivor Indyk, in a piece, in a book that he wrote about your work, suggested that you were a primitive, that there was that sense of the physical and the feral as part of our makeup that we come in contact with.
Yeah, look, I'm interested in that, and I think a book like An Imaginary Life, which was the second piece of prose, extended prose I wrote, although when I wrote it, I didn't necessarily think, and I was very lucky in not thinking that I was writing my second novel, which is the hardest thing to do. I thought I was writing a long prose poem or a monologue or something. So I was in the fortunate position of having written my second novel before I'd faced the problem of how to do it. That novel is absolutely about that. It's about how you step back from almost over-civilization and find another world which is primitive, but which has its own relationship to the civilized. And, I mean, in that novel, Ovid has it forced upon him because he's had his language taken away from him, and he's sent to a place which is, in his terms, wild, and where he's cut off entirely from that over-civilization that he and his writing represents. And that was a book I wrote thinking really about poetry. I mean, what I was really exploring in that book was my own questions about where poetry came from and what it was. And so that's why I didn't think I was writing a novel. I thought I was writing a book about poetry.
And why Ovid in that book?
Because I was very, very interested in the idea of metamorphosis. Yeah. And I was very interested in what the classical world thought metamorphosis was. And that is that it was it was about a reading of nature in which things were not separated in their genera or their genuses or whatever that should be, but had a power somehow of moving in and out of one another. And what Ovid does so wonderfully, and as Latin can do so wonderfully, is he loves the moment when a girl turns into water or turns into a tree or something like that, because there are things he could do in the syntax of the writing to do that. I was fascinated by that, but I was fascinated also by that kind of idea. Partly I was interested in it because as a student, I'd been interested in, what people at that time who were interested in Renaissance things were interested in was the great chain of being, which literally is about this chain of being that goes from rocks and metals up to angels. But I was interested that in a pagan world they had another version of that you weren't necessarily going from being human to angels to God, but that the pagan world was more open in its idea of where all that might be going. So all of that was fascinating to me, and it just all happened in my head at once. It was a book that was very strangely written because I had no idea I was going to write the book. I went on one of my shopping expeditions. I lived at Cremorne Point in those days and had to walk up to the top of Spofford Street. It took about 20 minutes uphill. And when I came back from that shopping expedition, I'd written something in my head, which was in fact the Poppy episode in that book. And I thought, I have no idea what this is. It's not a poem, it's a piece of prose, piece of poetic prose. I don't know what it's about. And quite soon after that, and this is quite extraordinary, I came home with a whole lot of papers I had to mark. I had to mark the HSC I was working in the English department, and I brought 150 HSC papers home, but I also brought home 600 first-year poetry questions that I had to mark. And there was a letter, and the letter was from somebody I didn't know, but he was a literary agent. And he said, I've been talking to Patrick White, and he tells me you have written a book about Ovid in Australia. And I'd love to see this book. And I burst out laughing and thought, well, first of all, the book doesn't exist. I haven't written it. And what on earth could I have said to Patrick about Ovid in Australia? And I actually then saw immediately that the piece I'd written 3 or 4 days before was exactly possibly that. And so I sat down and I wrote about 5,000 words of that novel, which was not the beginning of the novel, but some way in the novel. And then over the next, I kept a diary at the time, which I'd never done before, and somebody has reconstructed all of this. But on 21 days over the next 6 weeks, I wrote that book between 6:30 and 8 o'clock in the morning, and marked 600 HSC papers. No, it's 1,000 HSC papers and 600 first-year English papers at the same time. So my mind was somewhere, but it was not in a place that I had prepared for. Or so yeah, I mean, that book was a gift. I mean, I never wrote another book like that, or under any circumstances like that, or so easily, or so freely. So it was all coming from somewhere else.
The real miracle is that other writers have let you get to 80, David, with that kind of miraculous talent. It's time for your questions, if you would like to join the conversation.
David, writing as puzzlement, what were some of the puzzles you were working out in your novels?
Well, there were different things each time. Look, how things actually usually begin for you is, people often say, where do you get your experience? Well, most of us have more experience than we can deal with. But things happen, you hear a little story, you overhear somebody say something, you see something in a book, and somehow a question that arises in that sticks with you. And you go back to it and you say, why is it grabbed hold of my attention or my energy or my imagination in some way? What does this thing connect with in me that I can't let it go? And the trick then somehow is to let that little fact or perception or whatever it is, like a hook, kind of drag up out of you whatever it is in you and your experience or your memory or your fears or anxieties or whatever it is. You let that hook drag that up. And that, if you keep following it, can turn out to be a story or a book. Sometimes it begins with a conversation between 2 characters, and you don't know who these 2 people are, but the conversation will reveal it to you, and they're actually people you're dealing with, and a story is emerging. I mean, that's how it always is for me. I mean, people could tell you other ways in which books start, but any of the novels would have started in that kind of way. Except for Jono, which did begin with, the kind of direct experience that is likely to be in anybody's first book.
I just have a question about something that you said quite early on, about tactile language in poetry. I'm just wondering if you have any examples of poems that exhibit this sort of language. I mean, I'm sure there's heaps, but perhaps some that inspired you, and maybe you could elaborate a little bit on what you mean by sort of tactile language or language with a sort of physical presence.
It's actually quite difficult to answer that. All I can say is that that individual words, when I think of them, have a shape as well as a set of associations. And even a word like green, for example, which you think would be pretty purely just a reference to a colour, actually, those 5 letters in English for me, and the 2 consonants and the long extended vowel sound in between, that has a shape for me which is quite different from a word like yellow or red or blue. I can't explain that. I can only tell you that that's how I feel with words. And often when you're putting them side by side, I would be aware of the kind of texture of the line as I'm creating it that has to do with the different shapes of those words. I think that's how a lot of poets would work, whether they've quite thought it out in that way or would want to put it that way or not. What do you feel about that?
Oh, I think it's fascinating. Because I think for you there's also the sound patterns that you set up too, and so I'm imagining the interweaving of those as really quite fascinating. I suppose I'm thinking too of Bachelard in the Poetics of Reverie, talking about, in a way, the gender of words and what kinds of associations those set up. So I suppose in a way it seems to me a reverie on words. The other thing I'm remembering is that way in which you came to reading, where you recognised whole words. So for me, if you're asking how it is for me, it's not so much the visual patterning of the words as the sound patterns they make, and the opening and closing of the rhythms as they work.
I'd think, for example, of say 2 poets that I had been reading at the same time when I was very interested in poetry, might have been 17 or something like that, say early Auden and Yeats. And the textures of the words in those 2 poets are so different to me. I mean, Yeats he's interested in a kind of roundedness, and you can actually hear it in the vowels he uses and in the language. And Auden loves sharpness and raggedness, and that's what I mean by textures of language. And they're so different from one another. But I'm thinking not of later Auden poems, but of those early, very early poems of his that are largely about industrial landscapes and things, where he loves harsh sounds and jaggedness.
Yeah.
I don't know if that explains anything.
I once found a book of Yeats's drafts, and it was fascinating to me because he's got such a strange imagination, but I found that he started with quite traditional Irish song forms and then made them stranger and stranger as he reworked them. So I feel that song beginning in him.
There's a very strange recording of Yeats, which is wonderful to go and listen to. And it's the Lake Isle of Innisfree, and he says, "I took a lot of trouble getting the sound into this poem. I don't want to take it out. I must arise and go now and go to Innisfree." I said, goodness me. That's the voice that he was hearing in his head through those poems.
It is strange, isn't it? And you know, with your poems, because I think with Yeats, sometimes the sound his voice makes when I hear him is not the sound I hear when I read, the voice I hear in my head when I read his poems. It seems to me there's a bit of a difference. Whereas with you, the sound of your voice matches the sound I hear when I read the poems, the voice in my head as I read the poems.
I think one of the things that does is, it's very interesting. Yeats is one of the poets who who least tempts you to do anything in his style, because it is so so absolutely his voice. Whereas, you know, I mean, a lot of other poets offer you ways into finding your own voice. But I think Yeats is just, I mean, you can love him, but you would not want to, in a fit, try to write a Yeatsian poem.
Dickinson also, don't you think?
Yeah.
We have time for one more question if we have another question.
Yes. My name's Morris Alexander. You said some interesting things along the lines of whether your inspiration comes from outside sources, where you quoted the two poets, and of course there's a whole religious tradition of God speaking to people in dreams, etc., etc. And on the other hand, talking of dreams, it appeared that you're also saying that your inspiration, in fact, comes from inside. It's a product of what you can yourself invent in dreams. Would you like to expand as to whether they're contradictions or whether they're in fact reconcilable?
Well, I mean, I don't know if this is quite the answer to the question, but I did say that what gets you first on the hook is something that is happening out there in the world. So absolutely what you want to write about is about a world which is out there, and it is complex and challenging, and it belongs to all of us in some kind of way. But that other world, which we've discovered for dealing with that experience, which is interior, and which the world of dreams partly belongs to, but the world perhaps of a lot of writing belongs to, that is interior. And it's a matter for the individual writer of finding out, as I said, how that hook can pull up from inside you the experience which is yours, and the memories and the shapes of those things, and how they are related to that kind of public or universal dreaming that belongs to other people's lives. So there is a kind of way in which there's an exterior experience and an inner experience, and getting those to connect with one another is, I think, gives the exterior experience a shape which people recognize as the shape in which they also see things, but in which they also dream. I don't know if that makes...
It does. We need to... Oh, do we have one more question? Sorry.
I just found the essay that you wrote on experience somehow led me to thinking that led then into Ransom. And now that you've reached this wonderful age, do you find life more mysterious, or have you worked it all out?
Well, I think if I'd worked it all out, I could comfortably lie down and turn my face to the wall. No, I think if there's anything you discover, and anything that keeps you writing, is that the world is in fact more mysterious than it ever was. I was actually thinking today, I was on the plane and I was reading a page of The Australian, and it just described several things that were happening, like, I mean, mostly pretty terrible things, like fathers who'd murdered their children, and somebody who'd followed a woman who was blind and knocked her down, and a whole lot of things like that. And I found myself actually saying, you know, was the world always like this? Isn't this strange? I mean, it didn't seem to me that I'd got to any point where I thought that I understood better what we are or how we act, and the world actually seems almost a more puzzling place to me now than I think it might have appeared to me when I was 20.
I think we need to finish, but let's thank David for two things, not only for his presence this evening and his reading, but also for the amazing work that he did in saving the Mitchell Library in Sydney, which is one good news story in the papers. So thank you very much, David.
Well, how fitting that we should be treated to a conversation of such quality about poetry on the 23rd of April 2014, the 450th anniversary of the birth of that mystery of mystery, that voice of voices, William Shakespeare. I know you'll agree we've heard a most cultivated and absorbing conversation, and a true conversation at that, one that will illuminate our reading of David's work and of the many poets mentioned tonight. It's been terrific to hear two fine poets and intellects talking about technique, the knottiness and the challenges, the undying challenges of writing poetry. But also, as in David's case, mentioning the pleasure principle too, something that perhaps gets lost in an earnest professional age. And perhaps a few of us will think as we walk off tonight about that andante principle of David's. At this protean time in the magazine's history, it seemed fitting to us to begin honouring some of our greatest writers in a more formal way than we've done before. Accordingly, Australian Book Review has decided to honour from time to time a writer of great distinction, but one who also, and this has been touched on already, through his or her generosity towards other writers and whose advancement of literature per se has made an outstanding contribution to Australian culture. As you can imagine, it was not a very hard choice for us, and we were really delighted when David Malouf accepted our invitation to become the inaugural ABR laureate. For over 40 years, as we know and as we've heard, our laureate has produced an inimitable body of work. His awards are many, and they come from all over the world. The Neustadt International Prize for Literature, the International Impact Literary Award in 1996 for a personal favourite of mine, Remembering Babylon, the Pascal Prize for Critical Writing in 1988, the Prix Féminin Étranger, and in 1991, the Miles Franklin Prize for the Great World. Few Australian writers have been so laurelled, so respected, so widely and admiringly read. Apart from this illustrious body of work, our laureate has also been an occasional contributor over the years to ABR and a true and valued friend of the magazine in many ways. Recently, as we know, we had 2 new books from him, though no one really believes that David Malouf is 80. Please welcome the inaugural ABR laureate, David Malouf.
Thank you, Peter, for those words, but also for the laureateship. I've been impressed for a long time by the way ABR works. This magazine was founded, as most people know, a long time ago in 1961 in Adelaide by Geoffrey Dutton, Max Harris, and Rosemary Whiten. And it was founded really as a magazine which would review pretty much exclusively local work. And in some ways, that's what the magazine has always done. Went through a very, very good period when it moved to Melbourne and was in the hands of Helen Daniel. But I noticed something which pleases me quite a lot, and that is that as in recent years, two things have happened with the reviews. They still properly take up their duty to see that Australian works which might not get reviewed everywhere else are actually looked at in the ABR. They've also moved on to review very frequently important works from overseas that any literary magazine with a readership of people who are interested in what's happening in the world of writing would want to see reviewed there and be interested in. But also they've done something which replaces something which we had rather lost. We once had, as you might remember, the Age Monthly Review, and we once had the Australian Monthly Review, both of which were privileged in being able to offer readers long pieces of criticism rather than the short ones, which is necessarily what you mostly get in the daily papers. And the place that has now taken over that duty of the more extended critical piece, as you see in the case of the piece that Lisa wrote, is the ABR. And I think it's fulfilling something that we absolutely need in a monthly magazine, as well as in the 3 monthly magazines that we also have where that happens. So I pay tribute to Peter's editorship and his imagination in that way, as again in the way of establishing this new laureateship. I'm very honoured to be the first of the laureates. I assume there will be many more, and I look forward to seeing that some younger writer gets that break, as Peter said, that young writers often need, in the tradition, really, of the other prizes that the ABR has regularly, and which Peter has mentioned, for poetry, fiction, and for non-fiction. Thank you, and thank you all for being here, and thank you to Lisa for our conversation. Thank you.